Many old department store logos are amazing examples of design and typography. Let's see what we can learn from them, and I'll teach you how to make one. We'll also discuss what custom type could mean for both you and for your work. Now, we're going to talk about type, but the principles we're talking about can be easily translated to music production. The ideas here and the approach are really about artistic signature. So when I step you through the construction of a department store logo, I want you to focus on the idea of an atomistic approach to construction. Now, don't worry, I'm going to explain what that means. But what we're really talking about here is how to make work that could be instantly recognized as unique to you. Now, if you just get how to draw a department store logo from this video, that's great. But you might have missed the most powerful idea in the video. So here are examples, if you're unfamiliar. There's Robertson's, Buffum's, Pogue's, Sage Allen, the Hecht, and my contemporary interpretation in the lower right-hand corner. Now, historically, this kind of hand-drawn lettering was done with India ink and lettering brushes and required absolutely amazing skill. Now, if we use, in our process, we're going to use Adobe Fresco, an Apple Pencil, and the iPad. And I'll step you through the process that I use. But beyond the obvious, why would we learn this? Well, because custom typography can help make work instantly recognizable as yours and can form the backbone, a solid backbone of an artistic signature. Now, let's look at how these logos can play out in a contemporary context. So in a bunch of my videos, I talk about the power of constructing your aesthetic from whole cloth. And I've referred to that as an atomistic approach to construction. An atomistic approach to construction is really about finding the smallest divisible unit to construct your work from. And often, in my case, that involves custom typography. So thinking about the smallest divisible unit is one key to the construction of an artistic signature in work that is instantly recognizable as yours. So when you think about your work, what's the smallest divisible unit? What constitutes the smallest divisible unit of your work? Why? Because when you begin with the smallest divisible unit, your hand is telegraphed through a chain of choices. Those choices, they build and stack upon each other. Now, the longer the chain, as you're forced to make a nearly infinite number of choices, the more the work inexorably becomes something that only you could produce. Now, you work from the smallest divisible unit to the materialized actual object. So, in a way, the longer the chain, the better, the more unique that work becomes to you. Now stop and think about this for a second. In this video, I'm showing my drawing, hand-pulled screen print portrait of Billie Eilish, but in some ways, this video is really more about Phineas, her brother. Apparently, Phineas's production method is, to some degree, about field recording raw materials and chopping those samples. This is an example of what I'm talking about. So let's get down to the actual process of making. How do we make custom type? And how do we make one of these logos? And then again, what can we learn? What larger lesson can we learn from this process? Here are the references for my contemporary version, which you see in the lower right-hand corner. So here is mine, right? And if we look in the lower right-hand corner of this video, you can see my signature. Now, the new logo type injects into this signature a level of abstraction and geometry. The process begins, of course, on the iPad using Adobe Fresco with an Apple Pencil. And the first thing that I do is I use the document settings to turn on a grid as a visual reference. To my mind, when drawing typography, it's helpful to see a stable grid, even if I'm not hewing to it exactly. Now, the next step in the process for me is to establish on a different layer both an ascender height, which we see here. If you pause in Fresco, it will make any squiggly line geometrically pure or straight. And then I establish a baseline. Effectively, what I'm doing is I'm drawing a box into which this signature will fit. Now I set the background layer to a light gray and I selected a medium outline brush. I turn off pressure dynamics, velocity dynamics, and begin and end taper. Now I do this because I want a purely geometric line. Now it's important to point out that a light gray background and beginning with an outline brush is not the historical or traditional way of drawing typography or working on logos or this kind of process. It's a much more contemporary way of doing things. So let's take a brief second to look at something that's closer to the way that this might be done historically and the way that I was taught to do this. So the usual method is an identity or font design, logo design. And the way that I was taught was to work from the simplest articulation, simplest version, the black and white version, to the more complex articulations, not the other way around. But it is 2024 and technology opens all different kinds of possibilities. So quite frankly, I'm using the tool to draw live with an outline version of the work. If you feel more comfortable, as an example, in this kind of more traditional mode, by all means, knock yourself out. So an important component in this process, step in this process, is to set the smoothing of the pen tool to 100%. This will force the drawn line to be smooth. Now it replicates drawing by hand with French curves and rules. Now you Zoomers are going to have to ask your grandpa what a French curve is, because it's actually beyond the scope of this video. Now I'm always adjusting. I'm working, again, I'm in this process, or in this example, I'm working on an Elliott logo type, and I needed to adjust the baseline layer to make the overall volume, the overall rectangle into which I'm drawing, longer and thinner. But the important point here is that when drawing, you're constantly making adjustments, right? And then I have smoothing off. But the next step in the process for me is to select a different tool, a simple round pen tool with opacity set to about 50%. And I just write my signature. Now I have smoothing off, and you can see that. You can see how janky, for lack of a better word, this Elliott version is. It looks much more like a signature. And I'm doing that to get a kind of fluidity in the cursive Elliott. Now this, when drawing a rough cursive armature or skeleton for your logo type, you want an unusual silhouette. I can't stress this enough. Now you have to think about these typographic forms. The key for me, what unlocked the thing for me, is to realize that I'm not actually writing cursive. You have to think about these typographic forms like any other composition, like couture fashion, as an example, where silhouette and compositional massing are key.
And as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to getting our fashion right, there are 3 elements that are critical: silhouette, proportion, and fit. They need to be in harmony and balance, no matter what the items of clothing are, no matter how old you are.
Right. So Tim Gunn repeatedly points out the importance of silhouette on Project Runway. So in a way, it's not type that we're looking at here. In order to get this right, in order to get this thing to really function, what we're looking at is linear compositions. Look at these abstractions that I've created from this handwriting. It is the stress lines and the rudiments and the compositional massing and silhouette that make them work. So a key is a kind of mental game, a paradox, if you were. Your drawing type, which must to some degree be legible, but when doing this, you should actually see an abstract linear composition. This is a mental game. Forget that this is type when drawing. Focus on line, direction, stress, compositional mass, and silhouette. If you do that, these will work. Then with smoothing on, just draw. Now, focus here on, pay attention to the speed of my hand and your hand while drawing. You can notice that it is very slow and deliberate. I try pausing at the junctions in this L, isn't it, right here, which will allow for a kind of sharp termination. And then, as with everything in design or drawing, redraw sections if they aren't working. So when I'm drawing my signature here, the O, the lowercase o is the thing that screams to me that it is aesthetically unrefined. And what I'm attempting to do in this process is to create something that is in fact a kind of logo type and injects a kind of pure geometry into this work. So when I'm looking at this, I'm looking and I'm seeing that the I and the O are areas that are not functioning for me. So one of the great things about Adobe Fresco is vector trimming, which you notice this white dot in the lower left-hand corner of this screen. If you hold that down as an operator, you can vector trim, which is an amazing way of fusing vectors and removing. It's not the same thing as erasing. Now here, what I'm going to do is I am going to erase the vectors that constitute the O, in an attempt to create a more purely geometric O. Now, fresco, if you draw anything that approaches a circle or a straight line, and you pause without picking the pencil up, what fresco will do is it'll snap that almost O, as you see right there, to a pure geometric circle. We can see that the counter, the space between the I and the T, is not sufficient for the size of the O that I want. And so what I'm using here is a marquee tool to simply move to select the ELLI, and to move that out to the left. So basically, the whole point here is something fairly obvious, which is adjustment and revision. But really, what I'm focusing on constantly is I'm focusing on silhouette, and I'm using vector trimming to fuse these elements to make them feel as if they are part of one consistent and single stroke. Now, vector trimming, as I have discussed, is one of the most powerful components of fresco. If you're old school like me and came up using Adobe Illustrator, all of these processes of fusing vectors and carefully trimming corner points, those things had to be done manually. They had to be completely done by hand. That's not really what you can do with fresco. I would implore you, or I would encourage you to explore that. Now, one of the most important components in any design process is an iterative design process. So I would encourage you to explore variations. So when I'm doing something like this, what I do is I try to draw some 30, as an example, I would draw 30 variations of this Elliott logo. Inside of that 30 variations, I would try to identify potentially 4 directions that could be explored further, refined further. Here we see vector trimming again to fuse these strokes. But effectively, in exploring variations, you start out with 30, you refine that to 4 variations, you refine those 4 variations further, you select from those 4 variations 2, you refine those 2, and then you select your final from that process. It is a process of constant iterative refinement. Design as a whole is a process of constant iterative refinement. Drawing is a process of constant iterative refinement. So as an example, there's an evaluation process where when I look at the counter in the E, now technically that is correct. So in other words, if mathematically we were to draw that E, that counter fills with the white stroke. But to my mind, to my eye, I should say, it looks wrong. So here what I'm doing is I'm selecting a taper vector tool. Not there, but right here, I'm selecting a taper vector tool, and I'm opening that counter. Now, the final step in the process, you'll see that it's kind of janky. What I'm doing here is because I'm not spending enough sufficient time to do it right. But the ultimate process would be to export these vectors, to open these vectors in Illustrator, and to continue to refine them until optically the entire logotype flows, so that these stroke widths, the counters feel open if they're supposed to be open. But that, you can see that what I'm doing is it feels optically correct, but you can tell that there is a lack of aesthetic refinement. There's a lack of refinement to the actual counter itself. So I would import that into Illustrator on the desktop or Illustrator on the iPad, and I would work on refining that counter. So now basically the most important component in this entire thing, if you ask me, is if you extend this atomistic approach, the smallest divisible unit in your work, the atomistic approach to construction, to your aesthetic. Effectively, what you could create is you can create work that aesthetically anyway can be immediately recognized as yours. Now, that is the result of this chain of choices, this infinite chain of choices as you begin at the smallest level. The longer the chain, the better. The more that work becomes inexorably yours. So the ideas of an atomistic approach to construction can be applied to nearly any creative discipline. And I believe it's one of the most effective ways to create a unique visual or auditory signature in the most philosophical sense to the work that is instantly and immediately recognizable as yours.